The old woman walked into town, leading a horse on a frayed rope. Her boots were cracked. Her shawl was a flour sack with a hole cut for her head. She stopped at the bakery and waited for the baker to look up. When he did, she said one sentence. She said, "I will trade this mare for one loaf of bread." The baker laughed so hard he had to sit on his own counter. The men on the boards laughed with him. The horse did not laugh. The horse stared at a tall stranger across the street, and the stranger stared back. His face went the color of ash. He had seen that brand before. He had felt that brand burn through his shirt 20 years ago on the night a man was murdered. Could one loaf of bread cost a man his name? Tell me in the comments. The stranger across the street was named Cal Brennan, and he was 44 years old. He had ridden into Red Fork that morning on a gray gelding because the stage road was washed out and the freight yard owed him a week of wages. He had not planned to stop. He had planned to collect his money, water his horse, and ride west before sundown. He did not like towns. He did not like the way towns remembered men. The bakery sat on the south side of the main street. The sign above the door was painted in blue letters that had faded to almost nothing. A bell on a leather strap hung over the entrance. The baker was a thick man named Otis Pell. He wore a stained apron and a wedding ring on a string around his neck because his fingers had gotten too fat for it. He was not a cruel man. He was a tired man. Tired men can sound cruel without meaning to. When the widow stepped up onto his stoop, Otis was rolling out a tray of biscuits for the afternoon shelf. He saw the rope first, then the horse, then the woman. He almost shouted at her to keep the horse off the boards. Then he saw her face. He stopped shouting and just stared. She was 62 years old. Her hair was gone to white. Her cheeks were sunk in around her teeth. Her eyes were the pale washed blue of a sky that had been rained out for a week. She was so thin that the wind off the prairie pushed her sideways when she stood still. She held the rope in both hands the way a child holds the railing of a tall porch. She said her piece, plain and slow, the way a person speaks when they have practiced the words on the road. "One loaf," she said. "For the horse." Otis blinked twice. Then he laughed. The men on the boardwalk laughed because Otis laughed, and the laughing rolled down the street like a bottle rolling off a table. She did not flinch. She waited for the laughing to stop, and when it did not stop fast enough, she said it again. "One loaf. For the mare. Please." The mare was a bay with 3 white socks. She was not a young animal. Her ribs were beginning to show through her hide, and her muzzle was dusted gray. But her legs were clean and her eye was bright, and any honest man could see she was worth 20 loaves at least. Maybe 30. A working mare in Wyoming in '87 was worth more than most men earned in a season. Cal Brennan was leaning against a hitching rail across the street with a tin cup of coffee in his hand. He had stopped at the freight office, and the clerk had told him to come back at 3. So he had bought a cup of coffee from the chop house and walked out to drink it in the sun. He had not been listening to the bakery. He had been watching a hawk on a fence post at the end of the street. Then he heard the laughing. Then he turned his head. Then he saw the brand on the mare's left shoulder, and the tin cup slipped out of his fingers and the coffee soaked into the dust between his boots. The brand was a half circle over a single short bar. It looked like a sunrise sitting on a roof. There was only one outfit in the whole territory that had ever used that iron, and that outfit had been gone for 20 years. Burned out. Run off. Erased. Cal knew the iron because the iron knew him. He had a scar across his left collarbone in the exact same shape, because on a cold night in the fall of '67, 2 men had held him down on a barn floor and pressed that hot iron into his skin, while a third man stood in the doorway and watched. Ada Crowley did not know any of this. She only knew that the baker had laughed at her, and that she had a 6-year-old boy waiting in a sod house 4 miles outside of town who had not eaten in 2 full days. She kept her hand steady on the rope. She kept her chin up. She did not cry, because she had used up her crying a long time ago, and she had not bothered to make any more. The baker finally caught his breath. He wiped his eyes on the back of his wrist. "Lady," he said, "are you cracked? Are you simple? That horse is worth a wagon of bread. Take her down to the livery and sell her proper. I am not in the buying business." Ada said, "The livery man will not open his door to me. I have tried 3 times." Otis frowned. "Why not?" She said, "Because my husband is dead and the land is in dispute, and the men in this county have decided that a woman with a boy and no man is a woman with nothing. So they will not buy from me, and they will not lend to me. The mare is all I have left. The boy is hungry. 1 loaf will get us through tonight. Tomorrow I will think about tomorrow." The boardwalk had gone quiet. The wind moved a tin sign over the saddler's door and made it sing like a small bird. Otis looked at the horse. He looked at the woman. He looked at his tray of biscuits. He opened his mouth and shut it again. Before he could speak, a boot stepped down off the opposite boardwalk into the dust. The boot belonged to Cal Brennan. Cal walked across the street slowly. He was not a tall man, but he carried himself like one. His shoulders were square under a dark canvas coat. His hat was old and sweat darkened along the band. His face was burned brown by the sun, except for a thin white line that ran from the corner of his mouth down under his jaw. He stopped 2 paces from Ada and took off his hat. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was rough and low. He did not look at the baker. He looked at the horse and then at her. "Ma'am, how much for the loaf?" he said over his shoulder to Otis. Otis said 10 cents. Cal set a silver dime on the counter. He did not touch the rope. He said to Ada, "The mare stays with you. Take the bread. Go feed your boy." Ada looked up at him. For the first time her hands shook. She said, "Mister, I cannot take charity. I am not a charity person." Cal said, "This is not charity. This is a debt. I owe a debt to whoever owned that horse before you did. I'm paying a piece of it today. That is all." She did not understand. He did not explain. He set the loaf in her arms gently, the way a man sets a baby into a cradle. He took the rope from her hand and walked the mare 3 steps to the hitching rail and tied her there with a slip not any horse could break if it wanted to. Then he tipped his hat and went back across the street. Ada stood on the stoop with the loaf in her arms and the empty rope hanging in her fingers. The men on the boardwalk did not laugh anymore. They watched her like she was a piece of weather they had never seen before. She walked home with the mare behind her and the bread inside her shawl. She did not look back at Red Fork. She did not need to. She could feel the town watching her the whole way out, and she could feel the stranger watching her too, even after the buildings were small behind her shoulder. That was the day the trouble started. Not the day it ended. The day it started. Her grandson was waiting at the door of the sod house when she came up the rise. His name was Wesley. He was 6. He had hair the color of straw and a front tooth missing, and his father's narrow shoulders. His mother had died of fever 2 winters back. His father, Ada's only son, had died 3 months ago of a bullet through the lung on a piece of bottom land that the bank said belonged to the bank, and the deed said belonged to him. The deed had won on paper. The bullet had won, in fact. The land sat empty now under a tarp of dust, and the bank was waiting on the boy to die so they could write the whole thing off as abandoned. Wesley saw the loaf, and his eyes went wide. He did not ask where it came from. 6-year-old boys in a hungry house learn not to ask. Ada broke the loaf in half and gave him the bigger half and sat with him on the threshold while he ate it. She ate her own half slowly, 1 small bite at a time, because her stomach had shrunk and a fast bite would have hurt. The mare stood in the lean-to behind the house and drank from a bucket of brown water. Ada watched her over the boy's head. She had not looked at the brand on the mare's shoulder for a long time. She had not wanted to. The mare had come to her 4 years ago as a gift from her husband, brought in from a cattle drive he had ridden out of Montana. He had said only, "This is a good horse, and a good horse can carry a family further than a bad man can chase one." He had not said where the horse came from. She had not asked. She had loved him too much to ask the questions, whose answers could only hurt. But now a stranger had crossed the street and called the brand a debt. And Ada Crowley, who was 62 and tired and almost done, felt something move in her chest that had not moved in 3 months. It was not hope. It was a step before hope. It was the place where hope grows if you let it. She put her hand on Wesley's hair and she said, "Sleep early tonight, child. Tomorrow may be a long day." The boy nodded with his cheek full of bread. The sun went down behind the bluff and the wind dropped, and the prairie went quiet, and for one small hour the world was almost soft. Cal Brennan slept in the freight office that night because the freight clerk owed him a week of wages and a corner of the floor. He did not sleep well. He dreamed of a barn in the fall of '67, and a hot iron, and a man with a half-circle brand on his coat sleeve laughing in a doorway. He woke up before dawn with his shirt soaked through. He sat up on the floor and pulled on his boots and went out to the water trough behind the office and washed his face. The stars were still out. The town was still asleep. He stood there with the cold water dripping off his chin, and he thought about the widow and the horse and the brand and the boy he had heard about from the chop house cook the night before. The cook had told him plenty. The cook had been glad to talk. The boy was named Wesley. The boy's father was named Tom Crowley. Tom Crowley had been shot in March on a piece of land called the Bend, 4 miles out of town. The shooter had never been found because the sheriff had not looked. The sheriff had not looked because the man who wanted the Bend was a banker named Royce Halliday, and Royce Halliday owned the sheriff the way a man owns a horse. Cal knew the name Halliday. He had not heard it in 20 years, but he knew it. Royce Halliday had been the third man in the doorway of the barn in '67. Royce Halliday had held a lantern up so the other two could see Cal's chest while they branded him. Royce Halliday had laughed when Cal screamed. Cal dried his face on his sleeve and walked back inside the freight office and sat down at the clerk's desk and waited for the sun to come up. By the time the first gray light slid over the eastern bluff, he had made up his mind. If you are still with me, hit that subscribe button. Because the rest of this gets harder. He rode out to the Crowley place a little after 8. He came up the rise slow, with both hands visible on the saddle horn, so no one inside would think he was anything but a guest. The widow met him at the door with a single-shot rifle held across her chest, and the boy peeking out from behind her skirt. Cal stayed in the saddle. He said, "Ma'am." He said, "I am the man from yesterday." He said, "May I step down?" Ada looked at him for a long moment. Then she lowered the rifle and stepped aside. He came in and sat on the only chair, a stump with a board nailed across the top. The boy stared at him from under the table. Ada poured water into a tin cup and set it in front of him and stood across the room with her arms folded. He took a sip. He set the cup down. He said, "Ma'am, that mare in your lean-to was foaled on a ranch called the Sunbar in the Powder River country. The Sunbar was owned by a man named Eli Vance. Eli Vance was murdered in the fall of '67 by 3 men who wanted his land. I was 16 years old. I was Eli Vance's hand. They thought I had seen the killing, so they came for me too. They did not kill me. They burned the Sunbar brand into my chest as a promise, and they ran me out of the territory, and they told me that if I ever came back they would finish the job." Ada said nothing. The boy under the table said nothing. Cal said, "The man who held the lantern that night is the same man who owns the bank in Red Fork today. His name is Royce Halliday. I believe he killed your son for the same reason he killed Eli Vance. He wanted the land. He still wants it. He is waiting for the boy." Ada sat down on the floor very slowly, the way an old building settles when one of its beams finally gives. She did not faint. She did not cry. She put both hands flat on the dirt floor and she breathed. She said, "What do you want from us?" Cal said nothing. "I am paying a debt. Eli Vance taught me to read. He gave me my first horse. He fed me when my own father would not. I have owed him for 20 years, and I never had a way to pay. Yesterday I saw his brand walk down the main street of Red Fork, on a rope held by a woman whose son was murdered by the same man who murdered him. That is not a coincidence. That is a bill coming due. He stood up. He put on his hat. He said, "Ma'am, I will keep your boy alive long enough to inherit that land. I will answer Halliday for your husband and for Eli both. I will likely not survive it. But the boy will. And the land will be his. That is my offer. You can take it or you can show me the door." Ada Crowley got up off the floor. She crossed the room and stood in front of him. She was a foot shorter than he was. She put her hand flat on his chest, over the place where she somehow knew the scar lived under his shirt, and she said one word. She said, "Stay." The first week was quiet, and the quiet was the worst part. Cal moved his bedroll into the lean-to with the mare. He fixed the gate. He patched the roof of the sod house with sod. He cut himself from the south slope. He shot 2 antelope and smoked the meat in a pit he dug behind the lean-to. He taught Wesley how to load the single-shot rifle and how to stand in the dark without breathing. Ada cooked what little they had into something that lasted, and she watched the road. Royce Halliday did not come. That was wrong. Halliday should have come. Halliday should have ridden out the first afternoon with 2 men and a bill of sale and a threat. He did not. The road stayed empty. The wind stayed soft. The sky stayed blue. By the 4th day, Cal was sleeping with his boots on. On the 5th day, a boy from the chop house in Red Fork rode out on a borrowed mule. He was about 12, and his shirt was too big for him. He would not get off the mule. He said the cook had sent him. The cook had said to tell the scarred man that Royce Halliday had gone to Cheyenne on the Tuesday train, and that he had taken a federal marshal with him, and that the marshal had come back yesterday alone, and that the marshal was now sitting in the sheriff's office drinking coffee and asking after a man named Cal Brennan. Cal gave the boy a silver dollar and watched him ride away. Then he stood in the dust in front of the sod house for a long time with his hat in his hand. Ada came out and stood beside him. She did not ask. She waited. He said, "He is not coming with guns. He is coming with paper. He is going to have me arrested for the murder of Eli Vance. 20 years late. He has a marshal because a sheriff would not be enough. He wants me hung legal in front of the town before I can say a word against him. That is cleaner for him. The boy is no threat to him if I am dead, and the widow has no protector. He gets the land in a season." Ada said, "Then we leave tonight. All 3 of us. North. We can be in Montana in 2 weeks. Cal shook his head. He said, "Ma'am, if we run, the land is his. Wesley loses the bend. The bank takes it for back taxes by fall. Your son died for that ground. So did Eli. We do not run." She said, "Then what?" He said, "I ride into town tomorrow morning, and I turn myself in to the marshal." She stared at him. She said, "You will hang." He said, "Only if Halliday gets his story told first. If I get there first, and I get the marshal alone for 10 minutes, and I show him this scar, and I tell him about a man named Otis Pell who was a stable boy at the Sunbar in '67, and who saw the whole thing through a crack in the loft floor, then maybe the marshal listens. Otis is still alive. Otis is the baker in Red Fork. He was 12 years old that night, and he ran the next morning, and he never went back. I did not know it was him until yesterday when I saw his face. He did not know it was me until he saw mine." Ada sat down on the bench by the door. She put her face in her hands. She said, "The baker. The baker who laughed at me." Cal said, "The baker who laughed at you laughed because if he had not laughed, he would have wept, and a man who weeps in front of Royce Halliday's town does not bake bread in it for long. He has been hiding for 20 years inside an apron. I am going to ask him to stop hiding for one afternoon." He rode into Red Fork at sunup. He went to the bakery first. The bell on the leather strap rang, and Otis Pell came out of the back with flour on his hands. Cal shut the door behind him and turned the sign to closed. He said, "Otis." Otis went white. Otis said, "I knew it was you." I knew at the moment I saw the mare. Cal said, I need you for 1 hour. After that you can run again if you want to. But for 1 hour, I need you to be 12 years old in a hayloft, and I need you to tell a federal marshal what you saw. Otis took off his apron. He hung it on the hook. He said, I should have done this 19 years ago. I am sorry. Cal said, you're doing it now. That counts. They walked across the street together to the sheriff's office. The marshal was a lean man with a gray mustache and tired eyes named Hollis Doyle. He had been a marshal for 31 years, and he had seen every kind of liar. He let Cal talk for 10 minutes without interrupting. Then he let Otis talk for 20. Then he asked Cal to take off his shirt. Cal took off his shirt. The marshal looked at the half-circle scar over the bar. He looked at the brand book that Otis had brought from the bakery, a small stained book that had belonged to Eli Vance, and that Otis had carried with him out of the Sunbar 20 years ago and kept under his floorboards ever since. The half-circle over the bar was on page 4, drawn in Eli's own hand, with the words Sunbar Ranch beneath it. The marshal closed the book. He said, Mr. Brennan, put your shirt back on. Mr. Pell, sit down before you fall down. He stood up and he buckled on his gun belt and he said, Where is Mr. Halliday this morning? Otis said, he takes breakfast at the hotel at 9. Every morning. Eggs and ham and 2 cups of coffee. He sits at the table by the window. The marshal pulled his hat down. He said, Then I expect we will not keep him waiting. They walked the 3 blocks to the hotel 3 abreast. The town watched them come. Royce Halliday saw them through the window when they were still a block away. He set his coffee down. He put his napkin on the table. He stood up and he walked out the back door of the hotel, and he ran for the livery. He got as far as the cross street before his own sheriff stepped out of an alley with a shotgun and said, Mr. Halliday, sir, I am awful sorry, but I believe I am about to remember who I work for. Halliday went for his pistol. The sheriff did not. The shotgun spoke once. Halliday sat down in the dust and did not get up. It was over by 10 in the morning. The marshal took depositions from Otis and from Cal and from the sheriff and from 3 men on the boardwalk who had decided overnight that they too remembered things. The bank's papers on the Bend were void by sundown because the man who had signed them was dead and the loan officer who had cooked them was on the next stage to Denver. The Bend went to Wesley Crowley, 6 years old, with Ada Crowley as guardian and Cal Brennan as trustee. On a paper the marshal wrote out himself in the hotel dining room with eggs going cold on the next table. Cal did not hang. Cal did not even spend a night in a cell. The marshal shook his hand on the boardwalk in front of the sheriff's office and said, Mr. Brennan, I have been chasing the wrong man for 20 years on Royce Halliday's word. I am sorry for it. You are owed a great deal more than I can give you. But I can give you this. I can give you back your name in this territory. The notice will go out on the wire tonight. Cal touched the brim of his hat. He could not speak for a moment. Then he said, Marshal, that will do. He rode home in the long blue evening. The mare went with him on a lead rope. The sky was the color of a robin's egg, fading into the color of an iron pot. The bluff threw a long shadow across the road. He came up the rise to the sod house, and Ada was standing on the threshold with Wesley beside her, and the boy ran down the path in his sock feet and threw his arms around the mare's neck and cried into her mane for a full minute without making a sound. Ada did not run. Ada walked. She walked down the path to him, and she stopped a pace short, and she looked up at him and she said, You came back. He stepped down out of the saddle. He said, I told you I would try. She said, You did better than try. She said, Come inside. I have soup. It is not much. But it is hot and it is yours. They ate soup at the table that Cal had built that week out of a freight crate. Wesley sat between them with his elbows on the boards and his eyes drooping toward sleep. The lantern on the wall threw 3 shadows that almost touched, and after a while the 3 shadows did touch, and they stayed that way through the slow part of the night. Cal did not leave in the morning. He did not leave the morning after that. He moved his bedroll out of the lean-to and into the small room that had been Tom Crowley's room, and Ada hung a clean blanket in the doorway because that was the decent thing to do for now. He rode out to the bend with Wesley on the saddle in front of him, and they walked the four corners of the land together. The boy asked about every fence post and every dry creek, and Cal answered every question, and when he did not know an answer, he made one up that was kind. They built a house on the bend by the first snow. Cal did most of the building. Wesley carried nails in a tin pail. Ada cooked for the two men who came up from town to help with the roof, men who had been on the boardwalk the day she had walked in with the mare, and who had not laughed quite as loud as Otis had. They wanted to make it right. Ada let them. The bay mare lived another 6 years. She died in a green pasture on the bend in the spring of '93, with Wesley sitting beside her in the grass and her muzzle in his lap. They buried her under a cottonwood at the bend in the creek where the land had got its name. Cal carved a plank for her that said only Sunbar, and the year she was foaled and the year she came home. Ada lived until 99. She died in her own bed in the house on the bend with Cal holding one of her hands and Wesley, grown tall and married by then, holding the other. Her last words were a small joke about a loaf of bread. Cal laughed once and then put his face down on the quilt and did not lift it for a long time. Wesley named his first son Cal. He named his second son Eli. He named his only daughter Ada, and Ada Crowley II grew up to be a school teacher in Red Fork and to tell her students every fall the story of a frail widow who walked into town with a horse on a rope and traded one loaf of bread for a whole new family. Cal outlived them all by 2 winters. He sat on the porch on his last afternoon and watched the cottonwood lose its yellow leaves into the slow water. The scar on his chest had faded to a thin pale line he could barely find anymore. He thought about a hot iron and a cold barn and a boy in a hayloft and a baker in an apron, and he thought mostly about a woman with a flour sack over her shoulders who had walked 4 miles into town because her grandson was hungry. He closed his eyes in the sun. He did not open them again. The wind came up off the prairie and moved the leaves of the cottonwood, and the bend went on being the bend, the way good land does, long after the people who saved it have gone quiet under its grass.